Greetings, Culture Warriors. This is Jeff Vieira, author of Culture is Everything, bringing you another dispatch from the front. In our first series of podcasts, we focused heavily, given everything that's going on in the world, on the pandemic. This particular story is no exception, but I think this one may be a little bit more uplifting than some of our first stories covered. So today, we're going to talk to you about some good news and some folks trying to do some good things in response to this unprecedented situation. This comes to us from the New York Times. The headline is Pork Chops versus People, Battling Coronavirus in an Iowa Meat Plant. It's authored by Anna Swanson, David Yaff-Bellany, and Michael Corkery. And it appeared on May 10th, 2020. On April 10th, Tony Thompson, the sheriff for Black Hawk County in Iowa, visited the giant Tyson's Foods pork plant in Waterloo. What he saw, he said, shook me to the core. Workers, many of them immigrants, were crowded elbow to elbow as they broke down hog carcasses zipping by on a conveyor belt. The few who had face coverings wore a motley assortment of bandanas, painter's masks, or even sleep masks stretched around their mouths. Some had masks hanging around their necks. Sheriff Thompson and other local officials, including from the county health department, lobbied Tyson to close the plant, worried about a coronavirus outbreak. But Tyson was less than cooperative, said the sheriff, who supervises the county's coronavirus response, and Iowa's governor declined to shut the facility. Waterloo Tyson is running, the company said in a text message to employees on April 17th. Thank you, team members. We are proud of you. 5 days later, the plant was closed. Tyson said the reason was worker absenteeism. As of Thursday, the county health department had recorded 1,031 coronavirus infections among Tyson employees, more than a third of the workforce. Some are on ventilators, 3 have died, according to Tyson. The plant didn't stay closed for long. As meat shortages hit grocery stores and fast food restaurants, political pressure built to get dozens of plants across the country that had shut down because of virus outbreaks up and running again. After an executive order by President Trump declared the meat supply critical infrastructure and shielded the companies from certain liability, Tyson reopened its Waterloo facility on Thursday. New safety precautions have been added, like plexiglass barriers along the production line, infrared temperature scanners to detect fevers, face shields, and masks for the workers. Now the question is, will America's appetite for meat be sated without sickening armies of low-wage workers and their communities in new waves of infection? Workers and their advocates say Tyson's actions and recent federal safety guidelines have come far too late. They point to lapses that Tyson made in the first 3 weeks of April as the virus tore largely unimpeded through the Waterloo plant. As high-level executives lobbied the White House to help protect Tyson from lawsuits, the company was failing to provide adequate safety equipment to Waterloo workers and refusing the requests of local officials to close the plant, according to more than 24 interviews with plant employees, immigrants' rights advocates, doctors, lawyers, and government officials. Okay, so why do I say that this is a positive, uplifting story, given what I've just read to you here? Number one, this article by the New York Times, the slant of it is obvious, and it's obviously garbage. Say that outright. Meat is not optional. People have to eat. And message to the New York Times, not all of us can go down to our local Whole Foods and live off of kale smoothies and arugula. It's a necessary component of nutrition for millions upon millions of Americans. Those of us who don't live in a second-floor studio walk-up overlooking Central Park West. Okay? What these folks have done in Waterloo and across the country is they've kept food flowing to people who need to eat. We all need to eat. I suspect that if the authors of this article had ever missed a meal, they would understand what it's like to go hungry and why we need to keep the supply chain for food going, even in a time like this. Here's the other thing. Those masks that they were so critical of, they don't work anyway. The particle size of the virus is much smaller than the mesh of cotton fibers that comprise these masks. That means the virus floats right through it. Oh, but larger droplets it'll catch. Yes, that's great. Except when you sneeze, it's not all large droplets. If any of you have seen the time series videos of what's emitted when you sneeze, you'll notice that there's a fine mist there. And that's just what you can see. Viruses being microscopic, there's a lot you can't see. And these get propelled through the air pretty much as you would expect. A better policy is to sneeze or to cough into your arm. At least that will largely contain what you're emitting. But in these cases, these workers show up for work day after day. There's an assembly line. They have to be able to break down the carcasses, and you can only get so far apart because the carcass is only so big, right? You have to redo your entire process, which takes time in order to maximize space between people. Because guess what? This process was not set up with the requirement that people stand further apart. In fact, you don't want them standing further apart because conveyance costs money. And the larger you make the conveyance in order to spread people further out, the more money it's going to cost, the more liable and prone to breakdown it's going to be. It doesn't make a lot of sense to extend your conveyance so that people can maintain that level of distance apart. And obviously, until this pandemic, that sort of requirement was absolutely unnecessary. It would have been a complete waste of money. So Tyson's responding by putting in place some common sense measures. Get some plexiglass barriers up so that when people do cough or sneeze, they don't, the dispersal of what they're emitting is not quite as wide. That can help. They can sanitize that. That's something they can come down, wipe down periodically, and hopefully help. But bear in mind, too, a large number of these workers have already had the virus. That's what they said in the first wave. And again, back in that first wave, we didn't know what we didn't know. So now that they've been exposed to the virus, and the unspoken truth here in the article is they've recovered from it. Yes, we lost 3 workers. And that's a terrible tragedy for the company, for the workers, for their families. Terrible. But the workforce is bigger than 3 workers. And most of those folks who have had it have recovered from it and can resume work without infecting anybody. Why? Because they've developed antibodies to the virus. So if anything, the herd immunity within the plant is probably going to protect new workers from getting infected by this thing. Now, because of the fear the media outlets like the New York Times have engendered, many of the workers don't want to go back. They're worried about their safety. And they have a right to be worried. But time will tell whether that fear is a rational fear or not, especially given that many of them have already recovered from this virus. But what I want to call your attention to is Tyson's values. Tyson's purpose, raising the world's expectations for how much good food can do. This is straight from the Tyson website. We talked a little bit yesterday about the importance of a company having a purpose, knowing what it is that they exist to do. And Tyson clearly understands this. Our purpose not only reflects the time-honored principles we have lived by since the early days of Tyson Foods, it gives us direction to positively impact the world. And providing meat to people, nutrition to people, when they're locked down and quarantined during a pandemic, is obviously doing good. I want to call your attention as well to that last word there, world. Tyson, while it's an American company, doesn't only provide food to America. They provide food to the world. And beyond these shores, there are some countries that struggle to feed their populations in the best of times. And now the global supply chains especially have been disrupted. These people are suffering greatly. We are going to see the outbreak of famine, such as we have not seen since the end of World War II. As a result of this, these people are starving. They don't have the option of eating gourmet Brussels sprouts like the authors of the Time article do. They need calorie-dense nutrition such as Tyson provides. That is how they will survive this. Without it, many of them will die. Not from coronavirus, but from starvation. And I ask you, if you have a choice of ways to shuffle off this mortal coil, would you rather the long, painful death of starvation or the relatively quick one represented by pneumonia as a complication from getting infected with this virus? I know what I would pick. Your mileage may vary. But Tyson is attempting to do good here. They're keeping this open, not as a result of political pressure, as the Times likes to insinuate, but because they're there to fulfill a need. This is their purpose. There's no reason for Tyson Foods to exist if people need meat and they're going to shut down and not provide it. I ask you also, Tyson is a major customer for many a small family-run cattle or pig livestock operation in this country. If Tyson shuts down, what do you think will happen to all those animals? They are now going to be in a situation where they are overpopulated in the locations where they've been raised. Because they can't sell those animals to Tyson, the folks who are engaged in that animal husbandry are going to have to do something about it. They don't have any money coming in. How can they continue to pay to feed the animals? How can they continue to care for them? How can they keep them from disease? So what you'll probably see, if folks like the New York Times have their way, is mass slaughter of these animals and then tremendous waste associated with that meat. Because they've got no way to get it to market because no one will buy it from them. There's no supply chain for it. Okay? So Tyson is actually trying to fulfill its purpose. Tyson's strategy: sustainably feed the world with the fastest growing protein brands. Sustain our company and our world for future generations. Anyone spot anything evil in there? Only if you believe we can live off of air. Tyson's core values: we strive to be honorable and operate with integrity. Be faith-friendly and inclusive. Serve as stewards of the resources entrusted to us and provide a safe work environment. So once again, as with many companies, Tyson cares about safety, about worker safety. Thus, investing in plexiglass barriers and taking other steps to make the environment safer for the workers. They can't make it 100% risk-free. It's not possible to do so and still continue to fulfill the company's purpose at this moment. But they are trying. And those workers who come in the dark of the morning, before dawn, to get in there and work in an environment that by its nature has to be refrigerated, suited up, wearing masks, wearing other personal protective equipment, which the article doesn't note, has been very difficult to come by. There's been a big push to ensure that our doctors and nurses, our police officers, our firefighters, our EMTs have that equipment. But what's been lost in that push is that we have other folks, other heroes working on the front lines of fighting this virus who are not given that pride of privilege. They're not given this equipment as a priority. And so in a number of cases, you see nurses and doctors in empty hospitals making videos on TikTok wearing their personal protective equipment. What you're not seeing is the folks working in these plants, producing the food that we need to continue to live, getting that equipment. You hear them getting penalized as a company for not providing it, as though this was something that was common and should have been done before there was a pandemic. That's simply not the case. I happen to be working at a medical supply distributor during the last Ebola outbreak. We were a medical supply distributor. We had lots of medical supplies. But you know what we didn't have a lot of? We didn't have a lot of Ebola outbreak suits. And there was a very simple reason for this. There was no demand for Ebola outbreak suits. So we kept a relative handful around just in case, but nobody was buying them. It was basically on our dime. And then when there was an Ebola outbreak, all of a sudden, all of our customers wanted to have Ebola outbreak suits. Well, you go back to the manufacturer, you try and get them to step up production. You pay premiums for these things. You try and get a couple of your best customers to try and take care of them. And then the rest is rationed out, as you can. In our case, we refused to make excessive profits on those, but we had hospital systems coming to us offering exorbitant sums of money to have it. And the way that we had to triage it was to say, no, you will get priority if you have an actual Ebola case to treat. Because we wanted to preserve the PPE, personal protective equipment, resources for those areas that were actually dealing with the outbreak, not those that thought that someday they might. Now, same situation here. Until something like this happens, you really don't know where the resources are needed. And so you wind up making mistakes. One mistake that we made was to greatly overestimate the hospital caseload, and therefore we deployed far too much PPE to the hospital. It was an honest mistake, but it was a mistake. It's a little bit uncharitable for the media to now pound these manufacturing companies who didn't have any notion of whether they would be considered essential or not, certainly didn't know that there was going to be a virtually global shutdown of operations before all this happened. And now, for those that are still open and still working, they're struggling to get things such as sanitizer. Every day I see requests from people saying, hey, do you know where I could get some big bottles of sanitizer so we can keep the folks on the floor safe? Tyson's struggled with this, admittedly. But it's a function of the fact that they're continuing to work and continuing to operate and continue to fulfill the purpose of their company. They're continuing to feed the world. And let me tell you, feeding the world in this environment is turning out to be a lot more essential than the petty, score-settling, political nonsense that the New York Times and other media outlets continue to produce. We've got plenty of fare. We don't need any more fare. We're still being starved for relevant information. And if the New York Times has its way, we'll soon be starved for the food we need to live. But keep an eye on the companies like Cult and Tyson. If you know anyone who works producing the food that we need to make it through this thing, be sure to reach out to them and thank them for the sacrifices that they're making to do so. They are the unsung heroes of this pandemic. Thank you and have a great day.